Good morning, and thank you for sticking around to the bitter end. It is a really nice gift basket that we'll be drawing. Must be present to win, and a nice lunch to follow. So, like Jeff said, I am Cari Roth. I'm a relatively new partner in the Dean Meade office in Tallahassee. We have a blend of government relations and administrative law practice, and I have been in private practice most of my career, and I did do a stint for Governor Bush as a general counsel, like Greg, of an agency formerly, doesn't exist anymore, the agency formerly known as Department of Community Affairs. But I've been doing government relations work for about 30 years, and it's been always an interesting thing. Tip O'Neill famously said, "All politics are local," and I have my Cari corollary to that is all local politics are personal. And you know, those of you who particularly work in rural areas and watch your city and county commissioners, and I'm sure live that every day, but it is all about the people. And of course, we're into the silly season now, election season, and it's a time of year I'd like to leave the country, but so there's going to be some table resetting. I wanted to first talk, there's going to be a couple of constitutional amendments on the ballot. One is on the ballot at the end of the month. The primary ballot is August 30th. There's an amendment there which would make sure, that would authorize the legislature to make sure that when the property appraiser looks, if you put a solar or other kind of energy-saving device on your property, that doesn't add to the value of your property for tax purposes. There's going to be another constitutional amendment on solar, which is a little bit more controversial, and you'll start seeing a lot of press about that. But yesterday you had some discussion from several water experts about the water policy bill, and I wanted just to touch from a private sector view on that, because I've been doing this, and when I was at DCA, we did a lot of water policy as well. From my perspective, well, let me tell you a little bit of the background on this. So there was this bill was 2 years in the making. Commissioner Putnam's Office of Water Policy, was a really active participant in drafting of the bill. There's a lot of back and forth. It almost passed the year before this one, but it did fall apart, and that whole session famously fell apart over some big issues. This session was a lot calmer, much calmer, and the water policy bill was the very first bill that passed, so all the issues were worked out. From my perspective as a practitioner as well as a lobbyist in this area, I didn't see where the legislature made any significant, huge turns in process for how we deal with water. A lot of the procedures are still the same. What I do see as a difference, and I think is going to be really interesting as this plays out, is that they put a lot of stringency into the procedures that they have. So for instance, and without getting hugely lost in acronyms, as mentioned yesterday, there's a requirement to set minimum flows and levels for most water bodies, and that's saying what's the acceptable level of change before you're doing significant harm. But one of my themes on this water policy bill is get involved in this stuff. Don't wait, and go to those workshops and participate, particularly on minimum flows and levels, because what the legislature did, which is odd to me, we argued against it, was they said that this can be adopted as an emergency rule, and so it makes it much harder to challenge. So really important to get involved on the front end. One of the other things that I wanted to mention, I think this was mentioned yesterday as well, is there going to be monitoring for all wells 8 inches in diameter or more. It does, for agriculture, protects the users. If your use drops because you've instituted conservation measures, or your agricultural conditions have changed, like your citrus crop is no longer needing to be watered because the greening has affected it so much that you're not watering the groves, then you're not going to lose that allocation of your water. I know it was mentioned yesterday, but there is a new provision in the law that says if they're competing users, then the person closest, the potential user or renewal closest to the source is going to have a preference. So those are the changes on water quantity. I would say the same warning on the BMAP, which is water quality. So and there's a lot of water bodies in Florida that are experiencing stress for one reason or another, and so we have to establish what are called TMDLs for those water bodies, and then from that, if the water body is not currently meeting those standards, then you have to develop the Basin Management Action Plan, a BMAP. So those the BMAPs are going to be important roadmaps for the future. 20-year horizon set in 5, 10, and 15-year milestones to get to that point where you're meeting your water quality goals. There is a provision in the law that if you can't make it within that period of time, you can ask for more time, but you're going to have to explain yourself. What I think is unique about this legislation is that there's tons of reporting built into this. There's a lot of reporting that has already been built into the law, but included in the new reporting is grades for all impaired water bodies. But the agencies, the water management districts, are going to have to prioritize their resource projects. They're going to have to identify their funding sources and what their gaps are. So on the top of that, DEP mashes all of those reports together and gives a big statewide picture. And then uniquely, there's an office in the legislature called the Office of Economic and Demographic Research. And these are the people that they're given all of the bills that the legislature considers and said, what's going to be the economic impact of this? So this group, which is in the normal scheme of things, just looks at potential impacts, actually has some new duties under this law. They're supposed to do an annual assessment of Florida's water resources. What are our historic, current, and projected expenditures by all levels of government, including public and private utilities? Some of you probably participate in some of those local utilities or conservation districts, and supposedly those are going to be included too. And then this committee, essentially, of the legislature, staff committee, is going to identify the gaps between projected revenues and expenditures. In my 30 years of doing this, the legislature doesn't really like to be told in such bold detail where they're falling short. So it'll be interesting. For those of you who are in the springs protection areas, there are a whole bunch of springs that are included in special protections. Again, pay attention to the implementation of this bill as we go through. There are some limitations, and if you are an agricultural entity working in one of these identified spring shed areas, that you're not allowed to operate unless you do follow the best management practices. That requires you to have an agreement with the Department of Agriculture. Septic tanks are going to be really limited too. It's going to be a lot of new databases, and this is maybe the fun part of this bill. So if you do get outdoors for something other than work, there's a big conservation lands aspect of the bill, and there's going to be a new database with a mobile app and to tell you where you can get out onto publicly owned lands, what kinds of recreational opportunities are there, and what kind of facilities are there. So in our line of work, what we, you generally follow the money, and that always is a great indication of where the legislature's mood is. And you'll remember a couple of years ago, In 2014, the voters of Florida passed the Water and Land Conservation Amendment, which said that 33% of documentary stamp taxes are supposed to go towards environmental purposes. A lot of arguing back and forth, which I won't get into, about whether that includes more than acquisition of lands, but it does include more than acquisition. But there was some legislation last year implementing that amendment. This year, they put some spending plans in place for that money. And so the minimum of the lesser of 25% or $200 million a year will go for Everglades projects. Spring projects get $7.6 million or less than $50 million, and Lake Apopka gets a steady $5 million. And that's going to drop off. This constitutional amendment that was passed 2 years ago goes for 20 years, and these restrictions on the money or directions for the money will end in 10 years. So anyway, we'll follow the money. We got lots of good projects in the bill. I'm going to talk a little bit about the budget. If any of you have conservation easements on your property, one of the things that changed in the law is that you don't have to go file annually to make sure that the property appraiser takes into account your ad valorem exemption for your conservation easement. So like your homestead exemption, where you probably get a card from your property appraiser that says, just let us know if this has changed, it's going to be the same for your conservation easements. We also made some changes to verify that agriculture can continue to happen in conservation easements. It's been happening. I guess there was some issue with a core permit that someone was having, so we modified the law to make sure that agricultural activities can occur in a conservation easement. And it has to be either a current or historic use, and it has to be conducted in accordance with the best management practice. If you do have a conservation easement, that you've got activities on there, we made sure that we also added a savings clause to the bill, so nobody who's currently doing it was called into question for their activities. Any of you operate in special districts, water control districts, Chapter 298 districts, community development districts? All right, I'll just skip that stuff then. Agritourism has been a big issue, particularly for the Farm Bureau for the last couple of years, and they've wanted to make sure there have been some inconsistent provisions in local governments and how local governments deal with agritourism. And that could be anything from petting zoos to come out and see the farm. A lot of folks are now doing weddings in kind of rural settings. So Representative Comby passed a bill, House Bill 59, which prohibits local governments from enforcing any agritourism ordinances that limit agritourism activity if the land is still classified as agricultural lands under the Greenbelt law. The farm vehicle bill, it expanded what the exemptions are for riding farm vehicles on public roads, so you can get from farm to farm and not just within the farm. Also related to agritourism, the fire safety bill made sure that you didn't have, that part of your regulation by the local government of your agritourism activity didn't involve the fire marshal coming in and saying, you don't meet code, you can't have this activity out here. So there's a lot of safety provisions still built into the law, but essentially if you've got a pole barn, you're not having to worry about how people get outside. Those are going to be exempt. Unbelievably, there were some local governments that were insisting on sprinklers in pole barns if they were used for weddings. That's what we do in Tallahassee. We fix these big problems. So speaking of big problems, one of the things we did is a big, as usual, Department of Agriculture has a big omnibus bill, so we now have an official state honey. the Tupelo honey, one of my favorites. It preempts all regulatory authority for commercial feed to the department. It creates a new grove removal or vector elimination program, details to be provided. And it also did a lot of updating of the soil and water conservation districts. We've had some really great advocates for agriculture in the legislature for the last couple of years, and we've had Speaker Chris Foley. We really couldn't have asked for, a better advocate. He runs citrus and cattle in North Brevard, and he knows our business, and it's really been wonderful. And because of that, we had a really great budget year for agriculture in general. And there was a lot of money put into water projects. I know yesterday we had a good presentation on the Dispersed Water Management Program. I was advocating for money in that program for a couple of clients, and we successfully got, I think, $48 million total for these kinds of projects. And those will continue, because once you build these projects, you've got to operate and maintain them. We also had a great year for agriculture in the tax cut realm. Last year was really, really great. We got last year's is now sales tax exemptions for irrigation equipment, for replacement parts. There had been provisions in the law that said if you bought a new vehicle, you would get a sales tax exemption, but if you were actually just fixing one you have, that was still taxable. So we got replacement parts done, and repairs and trailers got exempted. This year, we added agricultural post-harvest activity and that kind of equipment to the list. Building materials, and especially new construction in rural areas of economic opportunity. Most of the rural areas that you probably operate in are in those rural areas of economic opportunity. If you have any question about whether you are or not, those are on the website of the Department of Economic Opportunity. Representative Albritton, who was supposed to be at this conference and unfortunately ran into a business emergency that kept him from here, he sponsored a bill which exempted agricultural lands from the collection of special assessments for fire protection services, particularly as during the recession, local governments got creative about their fundraising, and they had started to apply these assessments for fire protection to agriculture. Not a whole lot of need for protection for agricultural operations, and so that Bill 773 exempts it. And I put in the beginning of the handout where you can find more detail on all of this if you want to look at the actual bill. If you are in citrus, House Bill 749 revises the period in which your eradication program or quarantine programs continue to be classified as such, and exempts that you don't lose your greenbelt exemption if your farm is not in active use. You do need to get yourself current with the Department of Agriculture's program, so if you haven't done that and you're in that position of needing that greenbelt exemption, make sure you contact the Department of Agriculture. It also, that House Bill 749 also exempted certain farm vehicles from registration requirements, and again, doubled up, exempted the regulatory authority of commercial feed and feedstuff, preempted that from local governments.
Take your time, because they just took my microphone away, and they don't usually do that until I start speaking. So if they took it from me before I even started, there's a good chance I won't get through much of what I have. So take your time.
Well, let me just
Cover
talk about
everything.
one more thing. It is still agriculture. The marijuana business is up and running in the state of Florida. Is a lot of hair on this issue. I've gone to several legal briefings about this. You know, the federal government still classifies marijuana as a class one scheduled drug, but yet they've been passing provisions which prohibit the Department of Justice from enforcing it if you're in a state which has a robust regulatory program. So, as everybody probably knows, the legislature passed legislation a couple of years ago that allowed non-euphoric, no THC kind of marijuana to be marketed in Florida. Got tied up in a lot of lawsuits. And just now, those licensees, which were limited to people who had 30 plus years as a nursery license, that had to be part of the mix. But finally, those folks are up and running. And then, of course, the legislature modified the law again this year and expanded the kinds of people that can receive the drug and also expanded the kind of drug, so there can be THC containing drugs in it. So that hasn't been implemented yet. And then on top of that, one of the amendments that you're going to see is another medical marijuana amendment on the ballot. You recall one was on the ballot a couple of years ago. It failed narrowly. In Florida, amendments have to pass by 60% of the vote. And the law enforcement had some concerns. They, I think, attempted to fix those concerns in the new version of this amendment. So I think we're going to see marijuana be sold in more and more communities for medical purposes, at least for some period of time. I want to end up with just looking a little bit about what's ahead in the legislature. Greg's going to talk a little bit more. Several years ago, Senator Simpson, who has also been one of the great stalwarts of agriculture in the legislature, passed a requirement for the Department of Environmental Protection to do a study of wastewater reuse. And that report is out from DEP. You can take a look at it. There's been a working group in place that Greg is going to talk a little bit more about, maybe passing some legislation or revising rules to implement and try to have greater use of wastewater reuse. The water policy bill that I started out with, it's a really big bill. It wouldn't surprise me if there are some glitches that get brought to our attention. Workers' comp, you had a presentation yesterday on the court cases that have come down. There's been a fair amount of talk about trying to see if there's a legislative fix to the flaws that the courts have found in the law that they had passed before, which really did a great job of keeping rates down. And this is a big concern of business entities throughout Florida. I also think there's going to be, another run at trying to address economic development, particularly for the rural areas. We have new leadership coming in to the House and Senate. Senator Negron, who has made a huge deal about the algae blooms over on the East Coast, had led a special committee on that issue before. He will be our Senate president starting in November. And we have Speaker Designate Corcoran will start as Speaker. He's from Pasco County. We will not have a speaker like we had Speaker Krista Foley. We still have some great leaders in the legislature who will be there that know agriculture and will be our good advocates. We really do have a new day. The Florida law used to have a lot of incentives for economic development, and those programs have pretty much died. I think there is going to be an effort to try to renew something for the rural areas, which could really use it. And finally, I just want to say, I think from my perspective as an advocate for agriculture in the legislature, we just have it seems like we have a lot of environmental issues that are really top line in a lot of voters' minds right now. And agriculture is going to really have to get out there and tell its story. And we've, anyway, with that, I'm going to turn it over to Greg, and he's going to talk about some of what's happening on the agency side that we need to pay attention to.
Thank you, Cari, and thank you to you all for the opportunity to speak. Had the chance to work both both doing legal representation and speak to other agriculture groups, including represented the Florida Fruit and Vegetable Association, and got to know a pretty good idea, hopefully, of a lot of the issues that you all have to face, and have tremendous respect for you all and what you have to go through, if nothing else, just in terms of government regulation. And so I'm going to try to talk a little bit about that today. Cari had a nice PowerPoint presentation. A few years ago, I finished one of my short stints in government service as Deputy Secretary for Water Policy, and during that time I gave a lot of speeches, a lot of talk. I always had a PowerPoint presentation, not as good as Cari's, but I always had a PowerPoint presentation. And the whole time I was Deputy Secretary, I got one applause line, just one, and that was the day I showed up and I said, I don't have a PowerPoint. So I've repeated that. I do not have a PowerPoint presentation for you all today. So I'm going to jump into kind of a regulatory update with what's going on at the state agencies, or as I like to call this, Revenge of the Nerds. And if you don't know why I call it that now, you will by the time I finish, but I am cognizant that I'm between you and lunch and the gift basket, so I will keep this short. But hopefully you're getting the sense, I mean, water, like my son, is breaking out as an issue. And so it's really turning into something that every year we're seeing more and more activity in the legislature, and a lot of that legislation, and you'll see this follows through with, as a follow-through to that, you get regulatory activity. So the only non-state issue I want to talk about, and maybe the only one that's received, I would say, national attention, has been the attempt by EPA to redefine what are waters of the United States. You may have heard it referred to that way, or WOTUS is the acronym. It's an important issue because what are waters of the United States effectively decides whether water is covered by the Clean Water Act. Where that sits today is it is all tied up in court. At this point, it looks like it is tied up in one particular court, which did issue a fairly favorable ruling early on to the anti-rule forces, which includes the Farm Bureau, the National Farm Bureau. So that was an encouraging sign. I would like to tell you I know where this ends up, but I don't think anybody can make that prediction. I think it is safe to say that this issue will go to the U.S. Supreme Court. As most of you all are probably aware, with a 4-4 split right now, and unknown who or who will appoint that position, or whom it will be filled with, it's a hugely pivotal seat, however that gets filled. So it will probably get decided there. If for some reason it didn't get filled, the seat, I mean, a 4-4 split would go the way of the lower court. So this lower court that issued the favorable ruling is an important one to watch, and I would expect a ruling from that court sometime late this year or early next year. By the way, one thing on this, in Florida, because we have a very broad state rule, state law that says what are waters of the state as opposed to the United States, really the only thing that this is going to affect at the farm level, or for most people I would say that way, is what is and what is not a wetland as determined by the Army Corps of Engineers. And so if you had the Corps come out and they found a lot of non-jurisdictional wetlands on your property, that could change. Now the ag exemptions, in theory, haven't changed. But if you haven't been using it recently for ag, then this rule could affect you in that way. But in terms of your just day-to-day water discharge permitting and so forth, it shouldn't be affected because that's all state-driven and not changed. So let me move on to the state side. Cari mentioned the water bill. And how important that is, and I kind of very much agree with her assessment on a couple of points. One, it was not a major change in policy, but it was a huge bill, and as it turns out, it was kicking off a number of regulatory actions that will have the potential to impact everybody. Cari's already talked about springs, and that's a lot of work. Noah can attest probably to how much work that is for him and his team. For his team over at the Suwannee River Water Management District, since they have the lion's share of the springs. But the thing to pay attention to right now, from my view, is they're setting priority focus areas. These are the areas around the springs that all these new stringency the more stringent timelines, by and large, will apply to. If you're in the priority focus area, in other words, the timelines, the mandatory BMPs, all of that stuff applies to you. Sometimes the easiest way to make sure that you don't have to worry about those subsequent regulation changes is not to be in the scope to begin with. So I would pay attention, kind of echoing Cari's theme, be involved. I would pay attention to where those priority focus areas are being set if your farm or your property is anywhere near a spring, because getting yourself pushed outside the line could save you a lot of work down the road. Let's see. I'm only going to briefly talk about something called the Central Florida Water Initiative. They spent the first 12 years developing a model, a water model, and coming up with a water supply plan for this area that is basically Orlando at the north, Osceola, Polk County, some of these areas actually we're right in the middle of several counties right now. And that was the easy part, those first 12 years. They're now going to sit down and try to agree on a set of water management district regulations that will be common to all of this whole area, and that's where the three biggest water management districts meet. So they're going to be taking the regulations from these three water management districts and trying to come up with one set. That will be a challenge. The reason to echo, like, be involved again is because if you've been under one water management district's rules for many, many years and your water withdrawals aren't considered harmful to the environment now, which is the standard for issuing your water permits, then these rule changes could change that. It might be harmful in the future. So be involved. Also, as they continue to develop that water supply plan, the Office of Ag Water Policy is doing its best to convey how difficult ag water projections are, but that is an area where, and I would recommend being in touch with Steve Swinnell and his team up at the Office of Ag Water Policy, letting them know what your water needs are going to be if you're in this area. Cari mentioned water reuse, and that is, and it's not like anybody is sitting here going, oh, we're going to have a bill on reusing water. So this is water that comes out of somebody's house and after they've, had a bath or what have you, that is reused. And right now, most of that stuff goes to places like golf courses. In fact, Florida leads the country in the percentage of water that is reused, and watering lawns and that sort of thing, depending on where you are in the state. The consensus is that Senator Simpson wants to expand that, wants to do something big, but we don't know exactly what he has in mind, and that's what DEP is trying to figure out in these workshops. Ag is well represented there and has done a very good job so far of saying, please be careful, because we can't use that water for many of our crops. So so far that's headed in the right direction, but it is something worth keeping an eye on as legislation moves forward, because sometimes these issues start well and end badly, but so far so good. I want to end with something that's outside my area, because I think and Cari, thank you for tipping me off to this. It's not an area I work in, so if you ask me a question, I'm going to refer you to my partner in Jacksonville, Kevin Kane, who is the gift and estate planning lawyer. But as a regulatory update, I thought it was important. As I understand things now, currently, if you have an interest in a closely held business, such as a family farm, and it passes through your estate onto your heirs or it's gifted, the value of that transaction for tax purposes receives two discounts. One is a discount for control, which is to say if you don't have a majority control and it's a closely held business, what are you going to do with a minority holding in a closely held business? You don't have control. It's also subject to a discount for marketability, which is to say, who are you going to sell it to? So those two things have been around for many years, and IRS regulations are going to end that sometime within the next few months. So that is something that could, new IRS regulations are proposing to eliminate this discount by perhaps as soon as the end of the year. So this could have some very significant financial consequences. And hopefully you all as financial managers are aware of what I'm talking about and are seeing this. And I would normally encourage you to ask me any questions that you would like, but instead ask me and I'll refer you to Kevin Kane, who knew this issue very well. And with that, we will wrap up and we'll have 2 minutes for, I will mention, I was going to skip human health, but because it's in the news, I'll mention there are a set of water quality criteria, about 80 of them that have been updated. In some cases, about half of those actually were adopted for the first time by Florida DEP. The other half were updated. Some made a little bit higher, some were made a little bit lower. And despite what you read in the paper, I think DEP really was following the science in terms of updating these things. Now, there are certainly quarrels, and full disclosure, I represent one of the parties challenging, I represent the pulp and paper companies that are challenging the rule. So there are certainly some disputes over the science, but by and large, the changes that are being challenged were driven by EPA putting their hand at DEP's back. And DEP has tried to do their best job of navigating EPA's unwritten policies on the one hand, and good science on the other. I don't think there are many of those chemicals, as I understand it, that are still used as herbicides or pesticides. There are a number of herbicides and pesticides in there. If you are using outdated herbicides or pesticides, then it could affect you. And I think the other reason to care about how this turns out is because the methodology, again, significant pieces of which were driven by EPA, is controversial, and obviously, in my opinion, rightfully so at some places. And that's a methodology that, if adopted in the future on water quality criteria for herbicides or pesticides or other things that you actually use today, could also impact you. So that's it in a nutshell, and I see you.
Yeah. Question or two?
Ready for lunch?
All right, thank you.
Thank you all. Appreciate it. Thank you.